swearing in of reappointed and new commissioners by City Council. Reappointed Commissioner Member Michael Friend and newly appointed Commissioner Members Drobish and Lowry will take the oath of office. And City Clerk Susan Zito has the ceremonial duty.
If you'll raise your right hand and repeat after me, I, please state your name, do solemnly affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter. Congratulations.
With that, I'll ask the Secretary. I'll have the Secretary call the roll, please. Present.
Member Russell.
Here.
Member Lowry.
Present.
Member Drobish.
Present.
Member Briggs.
Let the minutes reflect that at the moment Commissioner Briggs is absent. However, we do have a quorum. We'll move on then to item 4, consent calendar. Do any members of the, well, let me back up. All matters listed under the consent calendar are considered routine and will be enacted by general consent unless any commissioner requests a roll call vote or unless any member of the commissioner staff wishes to remove an item for discussion. The reading of the full text of all resolutions will be waived unless the commission member requests otherwise. 3 items on consent: 4.1, adoption of the agenda; 4.2, adoption of the minutes; and 4.3, let's see, that was October 30, 2012, and 4.3, adopt the minutes of the regular meeting December 4, 2012. For note, the minutes of October 30 was a special meeting. Check, check. Oh. Thought it was on. It must have been my well-projected voice. I thought I was already communicating adequately. My apologies. So we are at item 4, consent calendar, and the 3 items are 4.1, adoption of the agenda; 4.2, adoption of the minutes, which was a special meeting of the City Council, the Planning Commission, and the Historical Advisory Committee of October 30, 2012, and then 4.3, adopt the minutes of December 4th, regular meeting. Does any commissioner wish to pull any item on the consent calendar, or may I have a motion to adopt?
Point of order.
Yes, sir.
Due to the fact that 2 of the members of the Planning Commissioner this evening were present for both items 4.2 and 4.3, it might be wise to continue those 2 items to a time when Commissioner Briggs will be present in which to reaffirm the minutes.
That's a good catch, Andrew.
Thank you.
So then I'll entertain a motion to adopt the consent calendar modified by the proper.
You could break them up into the parts.
All right, actually, let's just go ahead and pull all 3 items from the consent calendar. I'll entertain a motion to adoption of the agenda, item 4.1.
I move we adopt the agenda.
Motion? Second. Motion is second. All in favor? Aye. Items 4.2 and 4.3, I will need a motion, I guess, then, to continue those items until Commissioner Briggs is present.
Have a motion?
I move that we continue those until Commissioner Briggs is in attendance.
Have a motion
Second.
and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, great. That was the most complicated consent calendar I've ever done. Item 5 then is not applicable. Item 6, items of interest to the public. This is an opportunity for members of the public to address the commission on items which are not on our agenda. We generally try to limit the comments to 3 minutes. However, if you're particularly engaging, we may allow you a few more minutes. State law prohibits the commission from acting on items not listed on the agenda except by special action of the commission under specified circumstances. The chair reserves the right to limit the speaker's time to 3 minutes. The chair will recognize the speaker and ask that they state their name for the record. Personal attacks on individuals or comments which are slanderous or which may invade an individual's personal privacy will not be tolerated. Does any member of the public wish to address the commission on an item not on our agenda this evening? Seeing none, we'll move on then to item 7. Andrew, do we have any communications other than what might be related to tonight?
We do not, Chair Friend.
Thank you. Then we'll move on to item 8, environmental assessments and public hearings. Tractor Supply Company at 1360 Broadway, conditional use permit, CUP 2012-01. This is a matter regarding the landscaping and fencing details for the project site. I'm going to go ahead and open the item with the understanding that the applicant has requested additional time to provide the commission and staff with required submittal materials.
That is correct.
Great. So with the item open and with that background information that they have requested continuance, I would entertain a motion that we continue the item to our next regular meeting of March 19.
So moved.
Excellent. So I need that's a motion. I need a second. A motion is second. All in favor?
Aye.
We don't need a roll call vote on that? Thank you. General consent. Thank you for that. Then that brings us rapidly to item 9, which I think is the main item on the agenda this evening. This is the workshop session on the housing element update. I'm going to turn it over to staff.
Thank you. And one moment while I pause to turn on the overhead projector. You can do that, Mike? Yeah, plenty of seats. Michael.
Before we begin the presentation, I want to be clear that no action is going to be taken by the commission on this item this evening, but I would request that staff just provide an overview in terms of what the steps are for this document after this evening. Can you do that?
Absolutely. Welcome. Thanks for coming. It's housing element update time. This particular update involves an 8-year planning period which begins in October of this year and extends till October 2021. The procedure and why you're here today is the city is and wants to and encourages public participation whenever an update of any sort of a general plan element is conducted. This one in particular, state law and various state agencies highly encourage this interaction because what you can provide as far as comments can help the city direct its focus when we complete our update, and that procedure and process is ongoing right now. This update, as I mentioned, staff is doing our due diligence to get it done to meet our requirements under state law. The procedure will first involve the city creating a draft. The draft update to the housing element will then be submitted to the State Department of Housing and Community Development. That's the state agency that reviews all housing elements for all jurisdictions within the state, counties and cities, all of them. This particular planning cycle, we are under what's called the we're members of the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, and all of the jurisdictions that are members of that group have the same time frame in terms of this housing element update. And Once our draft goes to the folks at the Housing and Community Development, they will provide comments. It is staff's hope that we have very few comments in which to address, but all comments that are provided by them, we will address in that update to the housing element, and then present it first to the public through the Planning Commission, as the Planning Commission will serve as the first body that's appointed or elected within the city to first hear of the draft. And again, that version of the update addresses all of the issues and comments that the Housing Community Development Department with the state may have. The Planning Commission at that will be a public hearing, be very similar to what we're doing right now in terms of there'll be opportunities for the public to comment both during the process and of course at the meeting. And the Planning Commission at that meeting will be advisory, which means they will offer a recommendation to City Council as to the adoption of the document or perhaps potential changes that the Planning Commission wants to see before it gets formally adopted by Council. The next step would be the City Council step, which again is another public hearing. City Council would again be in this room. It'll be a similar setup. Public will have an opportunity to comment both before and after the process. And the City Council will have an option to return the document back to city staff for revision if they feel that there are issues or items that need to be addressed. They could also adopt the document, which we hope that that's what they ultimately will do. We do have a time frame in which we need to get a full adoption of the document, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. But at City Council, again, they have an option to return it back to staff to revise, adopt it as written, or adopt it and send it forward to the Office, Department of Housing and Community Development, where again they will ensure that the final adoption meets all the state requirements. So the time frame that we're looking at is in April, sometime in April. We anticipate having the draft available and sent down to the HCD, Housing Community Development. It's easier to give the acronym. They have a certain amount of time under state law to review that, and then they must return comments back to the city. We anticipate having at some time in as early as June would be the Planning Commission's first take at this, and perhaps only take depending on the circumstance and whether or not we've addressed issues that state law will require. The next step, again, would be due to the public hearing notice requirements. It's likely that City Council will not receive it until either July or August, with the anticipation that sometime during one of those months that Council will formally adopt the document by resolution, and then formally we will submit our adopted document back to HCD for their final certification. That's kind of in a nutshell the process. Chair Friend, do you have any questions?
I do, thank you. And I apologize, I'm a little bit out of sorts with this little bit different arrangement that we have in the passing of the microphone back and forth. So again, reiterating that the Commission is not taking action on the document. We're receiving our first input from the public. As well as from Commission. Commission will also have the opportunity to submit written comments should they desire. You're going to submit the document based upon our input, whatever refinements to HCD. Then that's going to come back and it's going to will be agendized for action first at the Commission level, and the Commission will take action in an advisory capacity to Council. Again, there'll be an opportunity for public comment. Absolutely. And so on and so forth. So normally what we would do is we would ask if any members of the Commission have questions of staff, I would make the suggestion, given the number of folks that are in the audience this evening, that perhaps we simply open the public hearing, hear the presentation, take any feedback from the public at that point, and then the commission can offer whatever comments they may have, at least at this juncture. If that's agreeable to the commission, I'm seeing at least one head nod, two, and if I get to three, I'll take that. So we'll take that as our process. So again, I apologize for being a little bit out of sort. So we'll turn it over to the presentation then at this point.
Thank you. Hey, welcome. My name is Andrew Painter. I'm the city planner for the city of Placerville. And the first slide I'm going to provide for you, there are several slides here, and although Chair Friend has kind of given an outline as to how the meeting will likely be conducted, it actually might be of interest to staff at this particular moment to kind of gauge an interest of the public today, and maybe we can focus and center some of our slides based on the interest that you all have. What I was going to present were slides based on the implementation programs from the previous housing element. That element planning period was from 2008 to 2000, till June of this year. And I was going to provide for you where we are in terms of implementing those particular programs. Some of them we have, others we haven't because of various reasons due to funding, necessity, and what have you. And other things we have fully implemented. But perhaps at best, if there are particular issues regarding housing at this particular moment, maybe that would be helpful for us to kind of gauge and address those concerns right up front than have to wait for that particular item to come forward. So I guess I would invite anybody who would like to discuss a particular issue regarding housing within the city to come forward, and if not, then I'll just go on with what I was proposing to do at the first outset. Yeah, come up to the podium, and so we can get your voices heard, and because this is going live to television land and streaming on the internet. So thanks for coming.
How exciting, a national audience. I didn't have a question or any intent to deal with the detail of what you're dealing with tonight. I more have a question about the flow of where this is coming to us from. This is coming to us from SACOG, is that correct? In other words, SACOG is communicating with its various planning commissions that fall under its jurisdiction that there are various requirements for the housing element. Is that correct?
Yeah, there are a couple parts to that. Yes, SACOG is involved. They generate a allocation of dwelling units that all jurisdictions within their group must provide, and it's variable. There are some communities that are required to have more inventory than others. That being said, there are also state requirements, state statutory requirements that involve other state organizations as far as enforcement. But there are state statutory requirements for updating the document and certain inclusions within the housing element. The state statute specifies the types of material and the analysis and a lot of the data that must go into all elements, and that's what these state agencies are going to make sure that that information is provided. So it's really kind of a two-pronged effort. Yes, SACOG's involved, but also there are statutory requirements as well.
So would it be possible to kind of draw a mental map of the chain of command, because presumably there's input, SACOG receives input. So where would be the top of this chain of command? Would it be state, or would it fit in with a national plan? What do the various spokes of the wheel look like? If that's an intelligible question, that's really all I want to know. How many layers of government must be complied with, or where does this really originate? Where is the top of the chain?
Well, I've addressed the statutory requirements. Those were laws that were passed by our state legislature.
California.
And signed into law by the governor at the time. Those statutory requirements have been evolving over the years, meaning there are additional requirements, and Director Webb can certainly affirm to this, that there seems to be more inclusions, more statutory requirements each year, and cities, both cities and counties, are required to address those requirements and put them into our housing elements. But as far as any other outreaching or global or national, no, I'm not aware of any such scrutiny or oversight by any state, or excuse me, federal or global.
Okay, so there would
body.
be several cogs in California. SACOG being one of the cogs, there would be several cogs, and they're kind of all working with the state plan. And they're all
Correct.
receiving the same instructions from the state.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andrew.
Andrew, I previewed this PowerPoint deck, and I'd be very interested to see it in its entirety with your narration. I think it would certainly bring me up to speed, and I think Michael, I can't speak for Michael, but I'd like you to make us sit through it.
Okay, certainly. The first slide addresses one of the concerns or questions by the commenter, and this would be our regional housing needs assessment. Now, all jurisdictions within SACOG and all jurisdictions within the other COGs that you talked about have similar numbers. They're not the same. Ours is, in comparison to the previous planning period, which again was 2008 to 2013, actually had a higher number. The number that we needed to provide an inventory for, this is not for the construction of. We don't have to ensure that construction is built for all these units and all these income categories. But the city must provide that it has an inventory, which means land use, zoning parcels that could implement, if constructed, for income categories as described on the slide: extremely low, very low, low, moderate, above moderate. Again, I want to stress that this inventory is not a requirement that they be built over these 8 years. We need to make sure that we have a physical inventory of properties and parcels in which we, in theory, could meet these requirements. Any questions on that slide from the commissioners? Public? No? So as I alluded to in the outset, the bulk of this presentation is an overview of the previous implementation programs we had at the last element. And staff thought it best to bring those forward and to inform the public that on some of these we've met, others we haven't because of constraints due to funding availabilities. There are other issues related to the timeliness in which we had the previous element adopted, which kind of precluded or made it very difficult for us to apply for any funding mechanisms, which a lot of these are triggered by and required in order to fully implement. So what we want to gain from this tonight is comments on these programs that again were in the previous housing element update. And staff is looking at these perhaps to continue forward, and we'd like to receive public comment on. Or are there other issues and other housing-related conditions or constraints that staff should be looking at with this particular element update as we move forward? So program 1, and I've kind of talked about it a little bit, but it involves staff looking at all of the vacant lots in the city. And this particular program was required because we deduced that there was a constraint because there's some feeling from housing developers during the last update cycle that there wasn't available land in the city in which to build. And as you can tell under the, if you read under the objective met, we've actually allocated and found parcels that have not been built on, and there are over 260 of them in the city. And based on their zoning, they have a possibility of accommodating up to 446 residential units. And what this basically means is with this vacant residential land availability and the number of units that it potentially could allocate or provide, that may have an indication as to whether or not the city needs to annex additional properties in order to establish or provide a particular density or number of units. It is staff's perspective, and I think I can speak for Director Webb, that whenever possible, the city wants to try to encourage what's called infill development. And infill development is really what it implies. It's you're actually utilizing the existing inventory of parcels to accommodate the current need for development. And with this caveat that we have quite a lot of residential units that potentially could be built and a lot of vacant parcels in the city. We think we've met that objective for program 1. But as development pressures occur over time, especially over an 8-year planning period, we may need to look at this a couple of times during this 8-year planning period. And so I think from our perspective, we want to carry this over to have staff kind of look at our inventory over time to make sure that we have some adequate capacity to handle growth. Any questions about that particular slide, and commissioners? Yeah.
With all the multiple programs, are you wanting to run through the entire presentation, then we can come back and discuss individual programs, or do you want discussion as we go?
This is kind of your meeting. I don't have a preference.
I think it would probably be helpful for commissioners and for the public if we just kind of clarify the process. I thought perhaps you were going to run through your presentation and then we would entertain comments and discussion after that, as opposed to perhaps interjecting comments and discussion in between.
Yeah, I did think that there's 26 or 27 different slides,
Yeah.
so remembering the 24th or the 12th might be difficult for, I know I have a difficulty with that type of thing, but
You know,
that being said.
I know for myself, I'm taking notes as we go along, and I would anticipate the other commissioners are probably doing that. I mean, I'll ask the commissioners what their preference is, but I mean, generally, I've found it to be a little bit more succinct if we hear the presentation and then we come back and ask questions after it's over, but I'm certainly flexible and open on that.
Well, for what it's worth, as one of the new guys here, I'd like us to go through the whole presentation so that we arrive at a baseline of understanding. I take Michael's point. I'm just concerned that we might not get through all 26.
Yeah, I mean that is, speaking from experience, at the exact opposite end of the newest member. My experience has been that when we talk on each individual slide, all of a sudden we do lose the time. So my recommendation would be that we go through the presentation, as you said, George, bring everyone up to a basic level of understanding. I hope the public can follow along with that and make some notes if possible, and then we can come back and open it up.
Program 2, infill development. I kind of talked a little bit about this at the previous program. This one, we wanted to provide the city and future city residents that there have been a series of planning projects that involve the potential for rezonings of property. One in particular is the Placerville Drive multimodal plan involving streetscape, and there were an outcome of that particular project that was funded, I believe, in 2009 and adopted by the city, I think, the year later, called for the potential of rezoning some property in the vicinity of the Placerville Drive corridor in order to make it a walkable, compact development. And associated with that is one of the programs, which I think is the last one, which is form-based codes. And so that particular document outlined some areas of town, or Placerville Drive in particular, that involved or could involve some changes of zoning in order to accommodate this concept that the Placerville Drive project would entail. Since we haven't adopted any of those, there have been suitable sites that have been addressed in the previous housing element. We would likely continue to include this program as we move forward, just because it has been assessed. We have not provided a time frame as to when we propose to address these infill and zone changes effective, but it could be related to whether or not funding is received as we move forward with a form-based code for the Placerville Drive area. Program 3, this one is very recently implemented. Last year, the city amended its zoning code in pursuant to and consistent with Senate Bill number 2, which called for all cities in California and counties to amend their zoning code to provide at a minimum one particular zoning district that would permit by right a emergency shelter. And the city has done so. The highway commercial zone within the city was designated and adopted by City Council as the zone in which one emergency shelter could be built. Again, the provisions within that code change would allow one shelter to be built. If additional shelters are requested, then each additional shelter under other sections of the code would require a use permit. Also, as you all aware the city has permitted a temporary use permit for a tent encampment up on the Upper Broadway section of town. The idea with this particular program not only was to provide the zoning mechanism to ensure that we have a zoning availability and permissiveness to allow such a use, but also there was a funding mechanism within this program that would help the establishment of a permanent facility, and staff has not had an opportunity to apply for such funding. That's why we envision continuing this and carrying it over to the next housing element planning cycle so that we can apply for funds when appropriate and when we have the availability and opportunity to do so. Program 4, to accommodate housing for persons with disabilities. This is a program that really comes right out of state law. The state law wants to ensure that people with disabilities have access to housing. Not only fair housing so that they're not turned away because of their predicament, but also there are requirements for local cities and counties to ensure that when new construction is built, there are provisions to accommodate those folks with disabilities. The city this is kind of an ongoing program for us. We implement the state's building code to ensure that access standards are met. We promote, and it is our policy to request that when new construction is proposed, we would like to see provisions for access for a variety of disabled folks so that they can have really freedom of living in an environment where their constraints are not, or their constraints for living are addressed through provisions such as door clearances and the ability to wheel around within their facility without help. And this particular program we envision to move forward and carry it over because it really is an ongoing effort. Program 5, senior housing. This program really comes from the knowledge that I think we all kind of know that overall our society is aging, and providing and having the ability to provide housing for seniors, not only seniors who can afford the Escatons of the world, which that's really on the high end in terms of a lot of people's comfort level, but there are other folks that are not so financially well off. Senior housing is an opportunity to provide the ability for those who are on fixed incomes, perhaps, who might not be able to afford such care in housing, such as Escaton. And I'm not knocking Escaton at all. It's just an option for folks. But other people don't have an option always. And this particular program, through the use of the density bonus permissions and provisions within state law, there are opportunities for bonuses for a developer if they provide housing and restrict housing or portion thereof to people of a senior age group. Unfortunately, during the housing bubble and crash, we haven't had much in terms of senior housing development, other than one project. I mentioned Escaton. They are building a 39-unit apartment, detached apartment structures as we speak. Those I do not believe are income restricted, which means they are market rate or above. But it is helpful to know that there are people wanting to build in this economy, and we hope that in the next planning cycle, this 8-year cycle, that we will have some senior housing projects come before you as a planning commission. So we would like to continue this program as well. Now, workforce housing is a term used when, it's really described here in the action statement. It's to provide housing that is affordable to and meets the needs of residents who are employed locally. Workforce housing is commonly used in really a lot of other jurisdictions that have very high rates of rentals, or the housing costs are such that they're astronomical. We all can think of perhaps some neighborhoods and cities within the Bay Area which, for many folks, they can live there, but others who are working paycheck to paycheck or even minimum wage, maybe they can't. How that applies to the city? Well, we do have a variety of different income levels within the city, and workforce housing perhaps might be an opportunity to allow residents who live here and work here to stay here as opposed to getting in their car and going down the hill where they can find employment or a place to live, and vice versa, reverse commute. We have not had any projects such as this over the housing crash during the last housing cycle, and so we'd like to continue this item as well, but we certainly want to hear public input. Program 7, density bonus. This is a implementation program that the city is currently undergoing. Some of the commissioners who are seated here were on the commission when they heard the staff's request for changes to the code to add the state density bonus requirements under state law. City Council is now undergoing this review. They had a meeting on the 26th of last month where they introduced the ordinance that would amend the city zoning code to include these provisions. And they have one additional meeting to do so, and staff anticipates that they will adopt the ordinance that we provided, which is consistent with state law. And when it is adopted, it will go into effect 30 days from, we hope, the 30 days from March the 12th. Or March the 12th. That being said, although there are currently no provisions within the city's code for density bonus, if the city were to receive a request consistent with state law tomorrow, we would have to apply the rules and regulations as stated under the state statute without the provisions that staff has provided and included that we're working towards and moving towards with council adoption. We think this is a valuable tool, and so does the state legislature when they adopted these regulations over the years. And it does provide an opportunity for housing for a particular income group, especially those who are in the affordable range, to have and build these units within the city, so that the city would have in its inventory an inventory of housing for the low, very low, and moderate income levels. Oops. I think I skipped over one. Pursue state and federal funding. This one I might actually turn it over to Director Webb, because I know he's a little bit more involved with where we are in terms of exploring CDBG funding. Would you mind interjecting that?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, as far as looking at potential sources of state, federal funding to look at any variety of things within the city, but in particular with relation to the housing element, we're currently working with a consultant to submit an application for CDBG Community Development Block Grant funds in this funding cycle, and we are working with that consultant to identify projects. And we went out to the community a couple of weeks ago and did a workshop with an eye towards getting ideas for potential CDBG related projects that we might apply for. The application deadline for CDBG funds for this year is coming up very soon in April, but we do anticipate coming before the City Council at their second meeting in March to kind of get some council direction in terms of programs to apply to CDBG for. The Community Development Block Grant funds, there's a lot of different programs within CDBG. There are a lot of different requirements to apply for and obtain CDBG funds. And so that is one funding source, but it comes with a fair amount of work going into that application process. some of the projects that we've looked at for this cycle and discussed at that CDBG workshop were things like looking at historic City Hall, Jane building, Confidence Hall buildings that the city owns for potential monies to look at engineering, structural engineering studies for the building. That in and of itself isn't obviously related to housing. That's more of economic development related endeavor. But more housing related things, we are looking at potential infrastructure for a water line replacement on the north side of 50. There's a neighborhood that if it qualifies from an income standpoint at a neighborhood level, we could potentially replace what is currently a very undersized water main with more adequate facilities and more current facilities. But again, in order to meet CDBG funding requirements, we have to do an income survey specific to that neighborhood because the city overall does not qualify and meet CDBG's housing income threshold as a city. So we have to, anytime we're applying for CDBG funds, we have to do it almost on a kind of a micro scale and do a fair amount of legwork to support it. Other programs that we're potentially looking at include the possibility of a housing rehabilitation loan program. And that's something that other communities and even the county has done in the past. And I think the county even has a current program where they have a loan program that's funded by CDBG monies that would allow the city to administer generally small loans to homeowners and in particular focus those efforts on lower income households for essential repairs to homes. Things like heating systems, roofing on a house to make sure that it's free of leaking during the winter. Essential, providing repairs to the water system. Essential functions of the unit would probably be first priorities in the city to make sure that housing remains habitable and in good condition. So those are some of the examples of programs that we're looking at currently for CDBG. I won't belabor it too much more than that, but happy to answer any questions, as we come back to that if we like. So
Appreciate that. In fact, I think you addressed one of the other programs we've got coming up, so that's actually a perfect segue. Program 9, permit and development impact fees. This always seems to be a concern and is often a constraint when it comes to developing housing. And this particular program calls for the city to look at it yearly and provide its report and findings to City Council and the Planning Commission. As it relates to really development impact fees, are they so high that they are really not inducing construction? And what are people doing in relationship to that? We hope that during this review that we will undertake it in this particular year with this update to the housing element. So don't look for a particular annual report because with the next update of the housing element, we will address this particular issue moving forward. So this will obviously be carried over to the next housing element planning period. Self-help housing, this is a concept where a property or a future property owner would help in the construction of a dwelling unit or dwelling units. The city does have some examples where this has taken place, and it hasn't been recent. It's been, would you say, maybe, well, I'm thinking Orchard Hill was probably several years ago. I want to, even prior to your tenure here as a commissioner. But that particular subdivision involved eventual owners of those units to help with the construction. And this particular type of housing project or program is often done for people who have limited income. And those who qualify can, with their help, with their construction help, can own their own homes. And again, we haven't had any projects like this within the last planning period. We hope that the housing market rebounds and perhaps this type of housing could be done, and it might be a project and program that we can fully implement the upcoming planning period. Program 11, Hillside Development. This is an adjunct of a potential constraint for the construction of dwelling units within the city. The city, as you know, has variable topography, but in most cases, and what we tell people at the planning counter is that most of the good lots in the city have already been built on. What we have left is some very challenging terrain in which to build a home. The city does have a zoning code provision in it that requires certain amounts of minimum lot area to parcel size to ensure that there is adequate room and we don't have property and construction on very steep slopes. When that happens, you typically get a very large cut. if let's say the property is 30 to 40% slope, in order to actually put a house pad on that type of a slope, you need to cut back into a hill a pretty good ways in which to actually put the pad. That typically leaves a scar on a very prominent hillside. One of the restrictions that code tries to diminish is those cuts by requiring more minimum parcel size the steeper the slope, average slope of a particular lot. That being said, the city staff, and there's a provision in code that would allow a property owner to utilize what's called a planned development for their project. And what that particular ordinance section does is it allows an applicant or property owner or developer to look at the entirety of the lot and to focus the development on those areas of the lot which are less steep. The caveat to that is there's a maximum density that's permitted based on the zoning, based on the land use designation. But what the planned development does, it allows for a clustering of development in very close proximity to one another, with the idea that the steeper parts of the lot are really not disturbed, or as disturbed as little as possible. This can provide many opportunities for construction because it does cost more to develop a property the steeper the slope. Most developers want to concentrate, if they can, to save money on portions of the property which are less steep. So this particular development standard program calls for the city to really analyze this ratio of slope to density formula. And I do have an answer here. The objective, whether it's met, yes. Are we going to carry it over? Yes. I believe, though, a couple of years ago, council, when they were evaluating the last housing element update, the 2008 to 2012, they had some concerns, not necessarily about changing the code, but they were kind of impressed that we don't change the code. I got the impression from them that they were fine with status quo because perhaps we weren't getting the development pressure that we may have had years ago when these code standards were put into effect. We as staff, we do want to continue this program because it has been addressed by some people. We've already gotten feedback from that the slope ordinance does have its constraints, to the development of housing, and at least that's the perception. So I think at this point we would likely carry this over to the next planning period. Program 12, the zoning ordinance revisions. I won't go into much detail other than that all of these have been facilitated and met. Staff has presented, and Planning Commission and City Council, both through recommendation and formal adoption, changed some code sections in the city that restricted single-family uses on multiple family lots, with the caveat that we were getting a lot of development pressure when the housing bubble was beginning. People were developing these rather large multiple family lots, but only putting one home on them. And what that does is it takes the multiple family zoning, eliminating its potential for really developing the density that that particular zoning would have normally permitted. It really reduces the density that the city fathers and mothers envisioned when they adopted that particular zoning for that particular area. So code changes were done to limit those single-family uses and multiple family lots when, at the discretion of the City Council and, Planning Commission, that they make findings that there are specific intrinsic issues or relations to that particular lot that would really prohibit the construction of multiple family housing. Perhaps the lot's too small, or perhaps the lot has lots of slope to it, and building density on a slope could be problematic. Those are a couple of examples. First-time homebuyer assistance program 13. This intimates that the city design a program for first-time homebuyers. Although this is a very interesting and I'm sure of well exampled and program that I think would help a lot of folks, which is just something the city could not find financing for during the last planning period. We hope that there might be opportunities either through CDBG funds or other mechanisms where this particular homebuyers assistance might be available. Fair housing, I've kind of talked a little bit about this previously. We want to ensure that housing is available to all, so equal opportunities. The city does provide brochures, and we do take, although very rare, we do take complaints when residents call and they feel that they are being discriminated against. Where there is a mechanism, we do direct them to the state. There's a state agency just for those types of complaints, and there's also a federal agency who has the resources in which to follow up and investigate thoroughly. So it's a program that we want to make sure that, since this is a housing element for all, we want to ensure that that housing provided within the city is equally an opportunity for all. Housing rehab, Director Webb kind of discussed the potential for obtaining funds and through CDBG or other provisions to have such a program, so I won't go into much detail there. Housing conditions survey, what I believe might kind of address this too. This is very helpful when there's construction and residential uses throughout the city that may be in need of financial and rehabilitation assistance. Just from looking at the building, there might be an opportunity, especially for those people who perhaps cannot afford the rehabilitation assistance to do such efforts. This survey could assist the city with a next step, which actually helping fund that rehabilitation program, such as number 15. Again, CDBG monies and funds would be crucial to conducting such a survey within the city. Code enforcement, program 17. This is an ongoing related issue that Development Services Department conducts. So we do inspections, not every day, but I would say a couple times a week, where we get code complaints from residents within a apartment complex, or a tenant of a rental home is complaining about related issues such as mold or access or things of that nature. And so staff does go out and looks at those issues, investigates to see if there is a code-related enforcement issue, and addresses those with the property owner to correct them. And again, the purpose here is to make sure that health and safety related concerns are addressed. Historic Preservation, Program 18. This is a program that really alludes to a rehabilitation program that the city really doesn't have at the moment. So with the action here, it is something that we have not met completely, but provisions or parts of it we have. The city has adopted historic preservation standards that we apply whenever construction or alterations to homes within historic districts, or when there are alterations to structures that are on our historic resource inventory. They go through a process that the Planning Commission is well versed on. They go before the Planning Commission for approval before a building permit is issued. Again, I already mentioned that the rehabilitation program was not funded, but the city has adopted additional standards that we look at whenever a alteration is proposed to a historic building or structure. Number 19, Program 19, Housing Choice Voucher. This was commonly known as Section 8 housing and is now called the Housing Choice Voucher Program. The city does provide documents and pamphlets as to those apartment units and other housing within the city that a potential tenant could apply for if there's availability at those particular units or apartment complexes. We do provide assistance with a member of the public who comes in. There is a county housing authority which also has a staff that can assist them as well, and in many cases those folks are really our go-to people. They have the kind of the tangible pulse as to the availability of these units throughout the city and surrounding the city of Placerville. So we anticipate including this going forward. We think it's a valid program. It certainly provides an opportunity for, again, those members of our community who need assistance in which to live. At-risk units, Program 20, this really refers to, has kind of an association with Program 19. There are those apartment complexes that received funding to assist those in need and in terms of a particular income level group. In many cases, those units that are available at a assistance level, they have a term, and the property owner is not obligated after the term is over. They could turn those to market rate. And what this particular program alludes to is these terms in which these housing apartments and property owners who own rentals, when their term expires, we want to engage those property owners to ensure and try to convince them that to continue the affordability provisions that they previously utilized, and so we certainly want to encourage that. The at-risk units, again, could potentially revert back to more of a market rate, which could price out those folks who reside in those units. And we would like to assist with these property owners, should they want to continue with this type of program, to have them and work with them to try to obtain additional assistance so that those mechanisms for affordability can continue for another term of it could be as many as 30 to 50 years. We're getting close to the end, folks. Mobile home parks. This particular program, we really have one mobile home park in the city that's recognized by the state, and it's the one off of Cold Springs Road, Hidden Springs Mobile Villa. And during the last planning cycle, this particular program alludes to in many jurisdictions in the state, especially during the housing bubble, there was pressure on, the residents within mobile home parks. They can request, and the property owner could agree or not, depending on their willingness, to convert these spaces and stalls to a condominium type of a development project. So instead of owning just your unit, you'd actually own the land and the unit at the same time. You would share a commonness. The grounds would be shared in common. What this potentially could do, and this is the reason why this program's here, is that should a mobile home park be converted, it might be a situation where the current residents may not be able to afford to buy their unit. Let me rephrase. Should a mobile home park be converted to fee title, which means, again, they own the unit and the ground underneath it, in many cases, those folks that live in a mobile home park, they live there because they cannot afford to buy a home. And this is a potential constraint. Again, it's rather nebulous as to what someone would charge, but the idea behind this particular program is to work with park owners and to discuss, perhaps, if they are considering this conversion, that we provide an opportunity for not only the park owners to participate in the process, but perhaps even assist them, if needed, with finding additional or alternative housing as we move forward. Weatherization, Program 22, this is kind of self-explanatory. Energy conservation, the idea here to make housing energy efficient will reduce their potential bills. So whenever we have an older development project, an older apartment complex, I think in the last planning period we had a couple of complexes that went through a complete weatherization retrofit. I think the city, if I recall, I was not the planner in charge, but I believe Director Calfee at the time, he did assist a couple of housing apartment complexes with receiving grant funding for that purpose, where the weatherization included window change-outs, weather stripping around openings, insulation, those types of things were addressed to provide energy efficiency for the residents that live there. The caveat to that, not really the caveat, but with new construction, energy conservation is a component of the building code, Title 24, which we enforce in the city. The city is also exploring another program to assist during new construction It's called the PACE program. I don't have a whole lot of details. I know Director Webb might if there's questions about it. We do plan on continuing that forward, as it's really an ongoing enforcement with Title 24 that the city is engaged in. Program 24. This program called out for the city to rezone property in order to provide inventory that staff, I will use the word erroneously, thought that we were deficient in providing the inventory required under the last needs assessment. After looking it over once again recently as we move forward with this particular update, we are not deficient in our inventory. We actually have quite a surplus. I don't have a whole lot of reasons why we did not see that, but we have no need or reason to implement this program because we have inventory to meet our needs assessment requirements for the previous planning period and this one going forward. Program 25 is an infrastructure program. If a development project meets a certain threshold in terms of impact fees and capital improvement costs, they could enter in this program that the city has adopted. It would allow them to finance those costs and spread them out over time. The city gets a benefit by having the fee paid all up front. Now, they continue to pay off this assessment, this impact fee over time, but the city gets the money up front and can utilize that money now, as opposed to incrementally receiving this money over time if we were involved with collection of the bonds over time. But in this particular program, the city receives the money up front. The developer works with the bondholder to repay their capital improvement fees and impact fees over the course of the bond. This is a new program that the city has adopted. It was adopted, unfortunately, during the housing crash. So we really had no takers. We had nobody who was building a project or projects large enough that could really utilize this program. It is hoped that over the 8 years of the next planning cycle, that if the city is still involved with this program, which I believe we still will, that this may be an opportunity for them. Last two slides, folks. Program 26, Form-Based Code. This was a program that was associated with a grant that the city had received just prior to the adoption of the last housing element, and it called for form-based code development for the Placerville Drive corridor. And that planning grant, the city received the grant, but the funding, we were not the high up on the funding allocation. We were second or third, if I recall, and the jurisdictions in front of us got the money. We patiently waited to see if anything would trickle down to us, and it did not. If such a program comes available this next time, perhaps Director Webb can correct me, but if such a program and opportunity comes forward again, due to the fact that we have a lot of the preliminary documents that would assist us in obtaining such a grant in the future are already in place, that the city envisions applying for such an opportunity in the next year or two, if available. And the last slide is why you're all here. This is a public outreach opportunity. We want to encourage any and all comments that you may have tonight. My next slide, other programs you might want the city to investigate and look at as we update this document, the housing element coming forward, And the final slide, if for those of you watching on television and the internet, we certainly, again, want your comments, and here are some opportunities for you to do so. We have a survey that you still have access to. It's been accessible since January, and you can access it from the City of Placerville website under the Housing Resources section of the Community Development Department, which we haven't renamed our department on the website yet, but that's coming. You can always submit your comments to us via email with the email on the screen, or you could submit your comments in writing or by mail at the address provided for you, or fax it to us. So that really concludes my workshop. I'm sorry about the long-winded nature of this, but Michael, do you want to run it from here, or do you want to? Okay.
Thank you, Andrew, for a thorough and riveting presentation. It's important. I'd like to offer to the Commission, in deference to the folks in the audience, maybe we could have public comment now, and then the Commission can deliberate, and anyone that wants to stay and listen to the Commission's deliberations certainly can. I also think, given the absence of Commissioner Briggs, we're not going to have the bylaws considerations. So only other item of business we'll have this evening will be the selection of no, we can't even do the selection of officers either, can we? No. So this will be the last item of business for the evening. So I'm seeing nods. What we're going to do then for all the folks in the audience this evening is, if you have comments and or questions, we're going to invite you to come up and present those to us, and then the Commission will offer its comments to staff, and you're welcome to stay and listen to that. I think that's how we're going to proceed. So I'll go ahead. Do I have to open the public hearing?
It's not a public hearing.
It's not a public hearing. So it's just open. So if you'd be kind enough to just state your name for the record, and then we'll go from there if anyone is interested in participating this evening. I see a lot of smiles and anticipation. And thank you for coming.
Thank you. And thank you for providing the documents to follow along with. I appreciate that. I wrote some questions before I had the documents, and this is one that I probably wouldn't have written with the document. Just a basic question about this entire process. What is the background, what is the purpose of, say, the state trying to pigeonhole, define, assign a certain demographic makeup for our community? Where does that come from? Second question, in constructing for the disabled, would this be required of all new construction or remodeled for units, housing units, or would it be a percentage, for example, like the handicap spaces in a shopping center? Infrastructure, would new and or improved public infrastructure for like water, sewer, roads, to accommodate new housing, low-income housing, would that take precedence over upgrading, repairing existing infrastructure? Do the Section 8, I don't remember the new name for it, do the Section 8 rental units that are committed to low-income vouchers, does that count as far as our required allotment, or since it is a negotiable thing with the owner, optional if you will, but do those actually count toward our percentage required? You gave an example of the mobile home and should it convert, if it were to convert to the occupant actually owning the land and thereby not being able to afford to remain in their home. that's not limited to mobile homes. I'm aware of experiences where upgrading existing housing sometimes makes the unit unaffordable to current occupants who also have to relocate. So it's not just limited to mobile homes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just for everyone's information, what we'll do is we'll take the comments we receive and then include them as part of our discussion.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah,
It's
thank
getting
you so
late.
much. Is there anyone else in the audience who'd like to address the commission on this? Welcome your input. Going once? Going twice? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to commission for their comments and suggestions. And then as Andrew indicated, we have the opportunity to, we'll have the opportunity to submit comments in writing, and we're going to hear this item again for formal action as an advisory role to the council. So I'm going to let you draw straws, see who goes first, and there you go. Actually, before you start, since we have just a couple of questions that were presented to us and that person raised those and are here still, why don't we go ahead and deal with those so they won't have to go home and listen to the podcast. And I think that these are probably questions best answered from staff's perspective anyway. So I'll turn the microphone over to the two of you.
Okay, the first question as I understand, what is the purpose and background of the housing element? The housing element dates, it's a required component of all general plans within the city, within the state of California, for all cities and counties throughout the state. It is one of the mandatory provisions required by state law. The components within the housing element, most of which are part of and codified in state statute. Provisions such as requiring analyses for particular subgroups of our community, such as those who are disabled. For instance, the housing element must include an analysis of what the current conditions are within the city, the constraints that are raised by members of the public and analyzed by staff are required to be analyzed under the housing element. Those are just one of several. The background for this, it really dates back. I don't have the year in which the mandatory provisions were required, but I think it dates back to the 70s as to when housing elements were required by all jurisdictions within the state. In terms of demographic makeup, I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'm going to.
More socioeconomic, perhaps.
I'm going to attempt an extrapolation or an interpretation of what I thought you might be trying to get at, because you also used the term pigeonhole, and the way I translated that was, what is the reason, or is the state trying to force us, Placerville, into a certain mold, perhaps a one-size-fits-all? And I think, I won't say the state's trying to consciously trying to do that, but certainly the state, I think, does take a one-size-fits-all approach across the state in developing a lot of its policies and the laws as they're developed. And the challenge, I think, that we have as Planning Commission and City Council and staff is to conform with the law, because we do have to do that. There are ramifications for not conforming with the law, yet at the same time maintaining consistency with the elements in our general plan, such as our scenic and historic and other valued aspects that we have here in the community. And so what we will be doing as the element is written, we try to balance those two things. We try to meet the requirements of the law and also our participation in SACOG, while at the same time preserving our identity as a city of Placerville for all the attributes that we have. So I hope that provides some insight. But a lot of this is driven, it's driven externally from the state to us. And it's our challenge is how we respond to that and meet that requirement.
The question regarding new construction and how it would apply to disabled folks, whether it's a percentage-based or how is it configured? When in many cases projects are assisted, developers are assisted in many cases funding mechanisms. Part of the requirements of them receiving certain funds is that they would be required to provide a percentage or infrastructure to accommodate accessibility to all. And so it's really in the nature of their contractual relationship with a funding mechanism is how many of these are built. Does the city have a requirement for new construction for a residential complex to be built with disabled access? Provisions in the state's building code have some provisions for that. Is there a particular percentage that the city has codified? No. I'm not sure I fully answered your question, but you're looking at it. Okay.
This is good for now.
Okay. In terms of the infrastructure, I don't. Maybe Director Webb might want to address that particular question.
Sure, yeah, happy to. If I understand correctly, I think the question is, would new infrastructure that is built as part of a new residential development, for example, excuse me, would that take precedent in some way over resources and commitments to maintain existing or repair existing infrastructure in the city? The short answer is no. The new developments, are required to pay their way for installation of new infrastructure, whether that's water, sewer, utilities, or roadways. Typically, new subdivisions, for example, the developer is the one that's required to install all of those facilities and to install them to city standards. And then once a subdivision is completed, and the city has inspected those facilities and made sure that they are up to par, so to speak, only at that time does the city accept those improvements as being now city improvements. And that's if they're to be public facilities. There are other projects where subdivisions where those facilities are done and maintained privately. Excuse me. But for the most part, they're generally public facilities. In addition to the installation of that infrastructure, new development, again, whether it's multifamily housing or single-family housing or condominiums, each unit within such developments pays for what we call capital improvement fees that go towards infrastructure and connecting to the existing city system. So they have to pay their fair share, and the fees are not insignificant, shall we say, for a new unit to connect to the water system, to the sewer system, to the roadway network. We have impact fees for water, for sewer, for what we call traffic impact mitigation, which is where each new project pays for, again, it's kind of pro rata share of adding to the system, as it were. And as cities and communities grow and development, comes online over the years, obviously what ultimately gets accepted as new infrastructure by the city has to be added to the inventory of what is to be maintained over time. And so that there, that as with all the development that we've seen in Placerville over the years, all of that eventually, or at some point in time, didn't exist. And as development occurs, the city takes on that responsibility, and the city organization and finances adapt to maintain that over time. So I'm a long-winded answer, I think, to your question, but.
The next question was related to the housing choice voucher, otherwise known as Section 8. Does it count towards our allotment or our allocation? No, it does not. The allocation is more or less a projection of what is envisioned as the need moving forward during, in this case, the next 8-year cycle. So what was it, 372 units to be established over those 8 years. That's the theoretical needs of the city as the allocation that was assigned to the city. So no, what we treat those as is those units that are under this voucher choice program is not necessarily a count towards or against an allotment, but to have an inventory of these so that there are people in our community who certainly qualify for such housing, and to have those established, we can direct a potential tenant who comes to the city and doesn't know where those things are. We can help them find those resources if they need them. The last question was really not really a question, but related to the conversion of a home. I'm assuming it's a rental. And improvements are made such that the property owners perhaps adding the cost that they've incurred to make those improvements and pass it on to the tenant. Is that kind of? It's no longer low. Yeah. Yeah, I'll note that. Absolutely. That's a great comment. That's a great comment. I don't really have a response to it other than I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does happen. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Without any further ado, Mr. Drobish, I believe, was going to lead us off on some comments.
Would anybody be interested in taking a break before I get into? I can address a lot of my comments in written form. There's some housekeeping in here, especially when it pertains to the approval of one emergency shelter, and in this language it refers to it in plural form. But just a reminder that the general plan, of which the housing element is a part of, is basically our community's constitution. And the general plan must analyze issues of importance to the community. And most constitutions, should not be amended for light and transient causes, but the state does require us every 8 years to go through and amend it. So I find it interesting. Also, the cycle of, we have to have this to qualify for CDBG grants, but we do not qualify because we're not poor enough, basically, by less than 1%. So I just find it striking that there's a lot of programs in here that seems to help benefit the lower income, and if built, would thereby decrease our ratio, thereby qualifying us for CDBG grants. I just find that kind of interesting. For the high density R5, 20 units minimum and up, if that's not really needed, what are the options of just repealing it or rewording it, reducing the densities? If I don't care if it's 12 units, 15, 18 units, up to 19, I'm open. But if it's not needed, do we really need to have it on the books and have a development come through and build something almost by right, I'm guessing, that we might not be entirely happy with? Also, I imagine, since this is just a workshop, that if anything I say or bring up or staff stimulates more thoughts from the public, that they would not be precluded from coming back to the podium. It's not a standard meeting. What are the numbers, if I missed it, from the previous housing element? The total number and then the percentage of low income, and the percentage increase or decrease of the low income from the previous element to this one.
You're talking about the housing units themselves?
Correct.
I do recall from reading in the document that in the period we had not increased any of the allocations. So the number 25 sticks out in my head.
I do show current new 2013 to 2021 being total units 372 with 133 total from low income to the lower income. But out of those 3 lower income categories, which is referenced in other places, what's the difference between the previous number and this one in a percentage increase or decrease? In rereading the emergency shelter ordinance, I had forgotten about this, but it does state that it's limited to a 6-month stay. So that's probably doesn't fit here in the housing element, but just wonder if people remember that. In the senior housing section, recently in the news, we heard about the lady who, living in this assisted care facility, was allowed to die because she was not allowed, the workers were not allowed medical treatment. Would the city have any say whatsoever in approving a development where this could happen here? Would we have any say whatsoever when the development was proposed and going through the system?
You know, and since you bring that up, it was interesting. I heard very late this evening on my way over here that the family has actually spoken up and said that was what she wanted. She didn't want it to be resuscitated. She wanted to go to this place, and then if she died, she died. And having, well, I am still in emergency medical services, and George is peripherally related to that too, on the communication side for sure. So this kind of situation strikes home. Not dismissing the question. I think there's a lot more to play out with that particular situation in the days and weeks to come.
For the workforce local housing, what kind of protections will we have that the housing actually goes to local city workers? That's good for now if anybody else wants to make a comment.
Thanks, Mike. George or Les, you have anything you'd like to jump in there with?
Just one simple clarification of Program 18. It's the historic preservation. Is the intent, Andrew, this covers both residential and commercial buildings, or buildings, general buildings? In 2 places it says homes and buildings, and then on the objective it says residential structures, but it isn't oriented just to residential structures, is it?
I guess there's a couple of ways to answer that question. Since it's a housing element program, the language is really meant to discuss residential structures. But, yes, the city, and you are aware as a commissioner that any project that affects a historic resource as determined by city council, any modification could involve a discretionary review by this body to before alterations that are visible from the public street are built. So would a rehab program be available for a commercial, is that kind of your question? Is that where you're getting to? Whether a rehab program would be available for a commercial entity? In the past, we have had such a program. Obviously, it wasn't part of the housing element, but I think we can categorically say we have no funding for such a program at this time, but there are potential opportunities for grant monies that could assist in that regard moving forward. Absolutely.
And I would think, in addition, if you're talking about a project where you're going to have residential either below or above the first floor building, then it's housing by definition, and it absolutely would be, it would fall under this program. That, I think, would be included.
Yeah, and I'll even, if I may, just add to that, there's even, you know, a relatively new code provision for what's referred to as live-work units, where you have kind of that inherent mixed use of commercial and residential, you know, perhaps within the same building. And you know, I'll cite the Precision Eye Care building, which is under construction now on Main Street, as a good example of a unit that's being done as a true live-work unit, and under those code provisions. So that's just an example.
Anything else, Les?
Well, the reason I raised that is there's two references to homes and buildings, and then there's one, the objective, it just says historic residential structures. So maybe the three ought to be uniform, so they all say the same thing.
George?
Well, first of all, whenever I get dropped into a new situation, I'm always grateful for iterative and voluminous in-briefs, whether it be the technology or the history. So I don't know if everyone else shared my enthusiasm for all 30 of those slides, but they were tremendously helpful to me. And I'm also grateful that we had the opportunity for this briefing without a full agenda of business to do. This has been an ideal way to ease into this, I believe. With regard to things like housing elements that are a reality for all cities in California, before I would allow myself to be too concerned about it being too much of a development straitjacket for a city, it's clear to me that both Vallejo and Atherton are required to have housing elements, and those two cities seem to have been able to pursue very differing goals for development of their city for the purposes of their citizenry without running afoul of this. So my sense is that to the extent that we have consensus and guidance from the citizens of Placerville, we can implement those visions wherever they may go. Thanks.
Thank you. It's customary for me to withhold my comments until the other commissioners are finished. Mr. Drobish.
Yes, I forgot about this one. In the Placerville Drive area where mixed uses and form-based codes are being proposed, in the general plan, under the commercial zoning, number 4, under purposes, is to protect areas in this designation, commercial, from encroachment by heavy commercial, residential, and other incompatible uses. So if mixed-use housing is meant to to join with commercial, but our general plan is saying in commercial, we need to protect it from residential, what do we do?
Well, I think, if I may, and I think we could probably respond to some of the earlier questions and comments you brought up too, Michael, but on that question, I think the key word there is incompatible. Because I think there are circumstances where residential, may well be very compatible with commercial development. I think there are cases when it's not. And clearly, as you get into heavier commercial uses, that presents more of a challenge, more of a potential conflict with residential uses. What you want to be cautious of, obviously, in those situations is not having the residential use, be saddled with nuisances and things associated with commercial, and then via complaint or other methods, driving the commercial out. But you also want to make sure that it's an attractive environment for the commercial to come to from a leasing standpoint, from a physical space needs standpoint as well. So, and there are certain uses that are just simply, I think, more conducive to that that environment. Now, that said, there's also thinking in terms of whether mixed use, residential and commercial are intermixed within the same building, or perhaps within a site, but not necessarily in the same buildings or structures, or even just within a zoning district. There's kind of the vertical mixed use idea of things, and then the more horizontal mixed use to be thought about too. So definitely agree that it's something when taken on and encouraged, it needs to be done so very carefully to ensure that compatibility of the uses. And there's potential benefits to be considered as well with residential uses, as on Main Street, for example. Residential uses generally, you find them above the commercial uses in more retail, mercantile, or office environments on the first floor, and residential above. Having residential uses above can, again, if done well, can really provide some life, some activity more around the clock in a neighborhood, and even the quote-unquote eyes on the street to increase security a bit. But again, it all comes down to the context and how it's done and how it's laid out. So very important, yeah. Going to maybe a couple of the other comments or questions that Michael had. I know one that you had asked is R5 the R5 zoning district really needed? I know that was an implementation item from our current housing element that we're in right now, and I believe it to be something that the HCD State Housing and Community Development was really looking to the city to implement at the state level. So the end result of that, of course, is that the city council recently, just in the last few months, had adopted an R5 zoning district, but the city has not designated any parcels as such. And of course, any proposal to designate a parcel, either by a developer or whomever it may be, to an R5 designation would need to go through its own project level analysis, and really kind of pass the community litmus test, so to speak, as to whether it's really an appropriate project and appropriate density and use of that kind of a designation. But in short, it kind of, again, a response to state mandate. Let's see.
If I can interject.
Yeah, please.
The city will show and can show that through analysis that we have adequate inventory where it will not be necessary for us to actually change the zoning at this particular time frame. I can't speak for ever. Of course, we could get influxes of population which would trigger us to reanalyze. But at this particular junction, due to the fact that we have adequate inventory of parcels that are available to meet the density needs that are put before us, that we will not have to do so, to change the zoning on any property to that 20-acre minimum.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, Andrew, that it's sufficient to say, I know your question about the housing units kind of showing a difference in those, particularly in the three lowest of the income categories between our current housing element and what's expected in by HCD and the new housing element. Absolutely, that's something that we can, prepare and then show a kind of a percentage difference in what those numbers are. I don't know that we have them.
Yeah, I could verbally tell you
Here
that
now, but,
the extremely low category in the previous planning period, 2008, 2013, was 25. Very low was 25. As you can see on the screen, those have been adjusted to 39. The low category changed by 1 to 56. Moderate went up from 69 to 75. Above moderate dropped 37 to 170 from 207. And the total in the previous element requirement was 388. So our numbers actually were reduced overall, but as you can tell, as I quoted, the numbers changed most drastically under the above moderate category and the extremely low and low, which went up. The above moderate went down. I don't have the math in front of me as far as the percentage difference, but that gives you kind of an idea.
Yeah, and when we do the
Sure, we can have columns.
we can have it more identify it a little bit clearer, so you can have kind of that the commission and the community can have that side by side comparison.
Also, I know Member Drobish asked staff for the actual number of units constructed during. That wasn't important. During the last planning period, we calculated that a total. Again, granted, this was because of the housing crash, but 124 units were approved construction or under construction right now, with the caveat that they are completed before the end of this planning period. If they are not, then we can count them towards the next one. So that's kind of where we are with that. Again, 124 units were built over those 5 years. Yeah. Probably a direct result from, we had, I know Mike wasn't here at the time, but we had a couple years where we had just a handful of houses built each year. And in fact, I think we had 1 year where it was like 2 or 3, or 1, yeah. But others, we had 10. This particular year with the Eschaton and their 39 units, that's the big push this year by far. I think we've addressed all those questions. Was there another one? I don't think that was, okay.
Just a couple of overarching comments, if I can. First of all, so we had a 2008 to 2013 planning cycle, right? And I presume that before that, there were other planning cycles. So, and in each one of those planning cycles, the city sets out objectives and strategies for meeting the objectives. It would be really nice, I think, to have a graphic that showed, well, here's what the objectives were, and then here's how we did in terms of accomplishing those objectives, right? We were, 10% successful, 100% successful. So just one kind of graphic that shows progress. That's just a general comment. The one thing that struck me as being missing from this, and I think, frankly, it's probably the format that it's given to you in, but just to consider, there are 2 things, actually, that I thought were really missing. There's no discussion or consideration for market forces. We're supposed to be supposedly achieving these targets, right? These targets are set to us by SACOG. But where is a consideration for market, either at a macro level in terms of the overall economic situation that we find ourselves in, or at the micro level, what's the market within Placerville? And then to me, why that's important is, and I guess my second point, is who are the partners? Now, in the document, I saw a long list of folks, agencies, I think, for lack of a better term, that the document was submitted to. You know, I think it was probably the Area on Aging and Social Services. I don't want to name them because I can't recall them off the top of my head, but they were in the document. Yet it seems to me that the partners that we really need to be working with are in fact developers and the chambers of commerce and real estate and property owners. There were at least one, if not, actually there were several of the strategies that actually required a willing participation by property owners. And I think you said that, you know, at the time of an expiration of something, then we engage the property owner. It seems to be, well, we should be engaging the property owners all the time. And I realize that doesn't apply to everybody, but I'm just suggesting a different, perhaps, kind of strategy, not different, an additional, not different, let's make it an additional strategy to helping the city achieve the objectives that you know you're setting out for yourself. And that's just the one part of the plan I just really I don't see that's really in there. And maybe the way, you know, you're supposed to submit it to the state to get it signed off HCD, it doesn't have to be, but okay, if we're going to go through all this effort, right, then, you know, let's try to really make it work and really be successful. So those are my comments on the document at this point. So.
Yeah, if I may, Chair Friend, I think your comment raises an important point in my mind, and I know that it's something like Andrew and I have discussed, and I think it's important just to reiterate now, while we're still relatively, at least early in the preparation process, which is, yes, the housing element is largely driven, and the timing of it is largely driven by the state. It's the one required element of our general plan, and it's required to be updated, you know, typically every 5 years now. We're on a little longer cycle. But and while there's certain components of it that are certainly kind of driven, or expectations that are established by HCD for preparing our housing element, it's important not to lose sight that this is a document also for the community, and for, you know, putting forth the community's expectations and community's desires and needs for housing. You know, to that end, you know, we shouldn't feel constrained, as it were, by just what HCD might be looking for in our housing element, but what we as a community, you know, would like to see in that housing element, and just don't want to discourage folks from thinking in those broad kind of terms. So, yeah, for what it's worth. Yeah.
Well, no, I think that's worth a lot, because that's an important clarification, and maybe somewhere in the document, in the foreword or something, that should be discussed. Because I had the impression, now I don't have it so much, I had the impression that, okay, well, here are our targets, right, and they come out of SACOG for the various income levels, and this is really what you should be striving for. And if you don't meet those targets, you're non-compliant. But I'm hearing that's really not the. First of all, the issue is we have to get the plan submitted and approved. That's really the main component. Meeting the targets is, yeah, okay, well, here's what the targets are, but the community has something to say about what they want to do, and it's not you're out of compliance because you haven't met these targets. Is that what I'm hearing? Because I think that's an important context for this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's meeting the targets in terms of the RHNA, or the regional housing needs allocation numbers that are set for us, which, you know, I think, as Andrew pointed out, we believe we're in a pretty comfortable place to meet those without the need or necessity to rezone parcels or do anything like that, which oftentimes can be the case for a community. And while it's there's the legal mandate, the meeting the RHNA numbers component to this, meeting the timing and constraints, and, you know, allowing ourselves the opportunity to apply for CDBG grants by having a certified housing element, you know, et cetera. It's it's really this opportunity to say to ourselves, hey, what do we want to be looking for and encouraging in not so much the land use development itself, but in terms of programs and policies for new housing, but even rehabilitation or retrofitting of existing housing as well. Just keeping an open mind towards those types of programs. Yeah.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you. Closing remarks, comments? Mike?
I'd like just a quick rundown of what kind of penalties the city would face, one, if we do not adopt a housing element, and two, what you were just talking about, if we do not meet our program targets, what potentially might happen.
Well, don't have a lot of experience with what the ramifications are, other than I can tell you that HCD legally would have the authority to, if the city does not, for one reason or another, have a certified housing element, one that's in other words approved by HCD, and to be approved by HCD, we're all going to need to demonstrate at least the ability to meet the zoning and land inventory and zoning to meet our RENA numbers, amongst other things that they'll be looking for. But in short, if the city does not have a certified housing element, the state could arguably invalidate our general plan, which is kind of the big hammer, if you will, over our heads. But what you kind of have to ask yourself, well, what does that really mean? Well, not having a valid general plan has ramifications, probably mostly and most prominently manifested in our ability to obtain grant monies for a wide variety of projects, not just CDBG, but there's a number of types of grants that require that the city have a valid general plan, or that we're able to pass city council resolutions supporting grant applications that make a finding, if you will, that projects are consistent with the general plan. Capital improvement projects, for example, have to be found to be consistent with the general plan upon their adoption. And so it has the potential really to cloud the issue if a general plan is kind of invalidated by the state and said not to be not recognized, if you were, by the state. To be honest with you, I don't know how that plays out in terms of whether how far that plays out and what the ramifications are on a grander scale. But that's really the primary component to it. Is in large part it kind of boils down to that general plan consistency, general plan validity, and ability to do things, especially grants that tie into it. So,
thanks, Mike. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. That concludes that item. Moving on then to item 10, new business. Item 10.1, Annual Planning Commission Bylaws Review. Due to the fact we do not have all members present, we have to continue that item. I don't know that any other action is necessary with regards to that. Then item 10.2, election of Planning Commission Chair and Vice Chair officers for March 1. That will also have to be continued until the next meeting where we have all 5 members of the commission present. Then that brings us to item 11, the Planning Commission photo. I presume 11.2 we would hold that.
The full board, yeah.
So that leaves 11.1 to be determined.
Yeah, that's kind of an open-ended. Does the commissioners have any matters they wish to present forward? I will start first, just to start the ball rolling. We anticipate having ex-Commissioner Wager join us at the next meeting.
Great.
So we can roast her. We do have a gift for her. So we anticipate having that on the agenda, as well as the tractor supply, landscape plan, and all the other things that we continue. You can hear me out in TV land. That's about all I can think of, although Mike may have another item related to the joint meeting from the 30th, kind of a bringing that back and perhaps some discussion on that as we move forward. Mike, do you have anything?
Well, I just want to formally welcome Mr. Drobish and Mr. Lowry as new members of the commission. And I think Les and I for sure are looking forward to working with them. And I think I can speak for Commissioner Briggs similarly. So, of course, here's what I'll say. Be careful what you wish for. Anything from commissioners? Great. Then the chair will entertain a motion to adjourn. All in favor? Aye. Thank you. We'll see you on March 19th.